Something felt wrong about my daughter's therapist. Everyone said I was paranoid. Dr. Lillian Foster had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park, diplomas from prestigious universities lining her walls, and a smile that made my spine tingle with warning. My daughter Sophie was 13 and struggling with anxiety after her mother's death 2 years earlier, and everyone from the school counselor to our family doctor had recommended Dr. Foster as the best child psychologist in the city. The first session, I sat in the waiting room for 50 minutes, staring at motivational posters about growth and healing, while Sophie was alone with this woman I'd just met. When the door opened, Sophie looked different. Not better exactly, but subdued, quieter. Dr. Foster stood in the doorway with her hand on Sophie's shoulder and told me the session went wonderfully, that Sophie was very responsive to her methods. She suggested weekly sessions, possibly twice weekly if insurance would cover it. Something about the possessive way her fingers rested on my daughter's shoulder made my stomach clench, but I signed the consent forms for ongoing treatment, because what kind of father would deny his grieving child the help she needed? The changes in Sophie started subtly. After the third session, she asked if she could have her phone during therapy because Dr. Foster said it helped her feel safe to have familiar objects nearby. I thought that made sense until I noticed Sophie was texting during sessions, her phone lighting up constantly. When I asked who she was talking to, she said Dr. Foster encouraged her to journal her feelings in real time through text messages, that it was a new therapeutic technique for digital native teenagers. Dr. Foster had given Sophie her personal cell number for these therapeutic texts, explaining in a follow-up call that she believed in being accessible to her patients during crisis moments. She said Sophie was showing tremendous progress, and the text-based journaling was accelerating her healing. My ex-wife's sister, Aunt Rebecca, said I was lucky to find such a dedicated therapist. My best friend Daniel said most therapists wouldn't give out personal numbers, that it showed real commitment. Everyone thought it was wonderful that Sophie had found someone she could open up to after 2 years of grief-stricken silence. By the 6th session, Sophie was asking to go to therapy early and staying late. Dr. Foster explained that Sophie had requested extended sessions because she felt safe in the office and was working through deep trauma. She said some patients needed more intensive treatment and that Sophie was ready to do the hard work of processing her mother's death. The insurance company approved twice-weekly 90-minute sessions based on Dr. Foster's recommendation, which she framed as medically necessary for a high-risk adolescent with complicated grief. I was paying $300 a week out of pocket. For the portions insurance didn't cover, but Dr. Foster assured me this investment would prevent Sophie from developing more serious mental health issues later. Sophie started calling Dr. Foster by her first name, Lillian, saying the doctor had insisted on it to create a more comfortable therapeutic relationship. When I questioned whether that was appropriate, Dr. Foster explained that traditional therapeutic boundaries were being reconsidered in modern practice, that research showed authentic connection facilitated better outcomes than rigid professional distance. Sophie's phone became an extension of her body. She was texting constantly, smiling at messages in ways I hadn't seen since before her mother died. When I asked what she was talking about, she'd say she was journaling her feelings or that Lillian was checking in on her progress. The few times I tried to see the messages, Sophie would pull the phone away and tell me that her therapy communications were confidential, that Lillian said parents reading therapy journals was a violation of trust. Dr. Foster confirmed this in our next parent consultation, explaining that Sophie needed a space where she felt her privacy was respected, that teens with trust issues required absolute confidentiality to engage in meaningful therapeutic work. She said my desire to monitor Sophie's phone indicated my own control issues that I might want to address in therapy. The implication was clear: back off or be labeled the problem parent. My mother said I was being paranoid, that I should be grateful Sophie was finally opening up to someone. Aunt Rebecca said I was threatened by another woman having influence over Sophie, that I needed to let professionals do their job. 3 months into treatment, Sophie asked if she could go to Dr. Foster's house for a session. Apparently, Lillian had a therapy office in her home where she saw select patients in a more comfortable environment. She called it immersive therapy, explaining that some trauma victims needed to experience therapeutic relationships in non-clinical settings to fully heal. Sophie was excited about this opportunity, saying only Lillian's most special patients got invited to home sessions. Every alarm in my body was screaming, but when I called Dr. Foster to express concerns, she had a response prepared. She cited research about alternative therapeutic environments, mentioned her home office was fully licensed and inspected, and suggested that my resistance might stem from unresolved issues about Sophie bonding with women after her mother's death. She asked if I'd consider family therapy to work through my apparent control issues. Daniel said I was being overprotective, that therapists having home offices was common. The school counselor said Dr. Foster was highly respected and I should trust her professional judgment. I said no to the home sessions. Sophie didn't speak to me for 3 days, saying I was sabotaging her healing because I couldn't handle her having a relationship with someone who understood her. Dr. Foster called to express concern that my refusal was causing Sophie to regress, that she was seeing signs of increased anxiety and depression directly related to my interference with treatment. She suggested Sophie might need to be hospitalized if her mental health continued to decline, and that she would be obligated to report any parental behavior that endangered Sophie's well-being. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Approve the home sessions or face accusations of neglect. I approved them, hating myself for giving in to manipulation, but terrified of losing custody or having Sophie institutionalized. My sister said I was doing the right thing by trusting the expert. My father said I was worrying over nothing, that home offices were normal for private practice therapists. Nobody else seemed to feel the wrongness that was eating at me constantly. The first home session, I drove Sophie to Dr. Foster's house in an upscale neighborhood. The house was large and modern with a separate entrance for the therapy office. Dr. Foster greeted us at the door wearing jeans and a casual sweater, so different from her professional office attire. She showed me the therapy space, which looked more like a cozy den than a medical office, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. She explained this environment helped patients relax and access difficult emotions more easily. Sophie practically ran inside, hugging Dr. Foster in greeting. The hug lasted too long, Dr. Foster's hand stroking Sophie's hair in a way that felt maternal, but also somehow inappropriate. I asked what time to pick Sophie up, and Dr. Foster said to give them 2 hours, that the home sessions were more intensive. When I returned 2 hours later, Sophie was wearing different clothes. Dr. Foster explained that Sophie had spilled tea on her shirt and borrowed something from Lillian's daughter's closet. The explanation made sense, but Sophie's flushed face and the way she wouldn't meet my eyes made my stomach turn. Home sessions became weekly, then twice weekly. Sophie was spending more time at Dr. Foster's house than at our own home. She'd come back wearing different clothes regularly, saying they'd done art therapy that got messy or movement therapy that required athletic wear. Dr. Foster always had reasonable explanations. Sometimes Sophie would mention that Lillian had made dinner for them because the session ran long. Sometimes she'd mention watching movies in Lillian's living room because film therapy was part of their treatment plan. Dr. Foster confirmed all of this in our monthly parent consultations, explaining that intensive attachment-based therapy required creating family-like bonds to help Sophie process her mother's death. She said Sophie was finally learning to trust again, to open up about her deepest fears and wounds. The progress reports Dr. Foster wrote for insurance were glowing, describing significant improvements in Sophie's functioning. But at home, Sophie was more distant than ever, treating me like an inconvenience, spending hours in her room texting Lillian, talking about Lillian constantly. I started researching Dr. Foster online. Her credentials were legitimate, her reviews mostly positive, though a few mentioned she had intense relationships with patients that some found concerning. I found her social media accounts, which were mostly professional, but noticed she'd recently added photos of Sophie. In one photo, Sophie was at Dr. Foster's house wearing pajamas, captioned as a therapeutic sleepover for intensive trauma processing. I hadn't approved any sleepover. When I confronted Sophie, she said Lillian had texted me about it and I'd said yes. I checked my messages and found nothing. Sophie insisted I must have deleted it or forgotten. Dr. Foster called and explained that Sophie had experienced a severe anxiety episode after a session and she'd made a clinical judgment that Sophie needed overnight supervision. She said she'd tried to call me but couldn't reach me, so she'd made the decision based on her professional assessment that Sophie was at risk. She asked why I was making her therapeutic choices into something suspicious, whether I had trust issues with women in authority. My brother said I was being paranoid, that the therapist had probably saved Sophie's life. Sophie started asking to spend entire weekends at Dr. Foster's house. She called them therapeutic retreats, saying Lillian offered intensive weekend programs for patients who needed accelerated healing. Dr. Foster sent me detailed schedules of activities: morning meditation, journaling sessions, therapeutic art projects, nature walks for mindfulness practice, and group sessions with other patients who'd become like family to Sophie. When I asked to meet these other patients and their parents, Dr. Foster said that would violate their confidentiality and therapeutic boundaries. She provided testimonials from other parents praising her weekend programs, all glowing reviews about transformed children and breakthrough healing. I felt trapped between my instincts screaming danger and a professional system telling me I was the problem. My mother told me I needed to let go and trust that Sophie was finally healing. Aunt Rebecca said I was being possessive and needed to accept that Sophie had found a mother figure to help her through grief I couldn't understand. The breaking point came when I found Sophie's phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. I know I shouldn't have looked, but every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. The text messages between Sophie and Dr. Foster were thousands of messages deep, going back months. They weren't therapeutic journals, they were intimate conversations. Lillian calling Sophie baby and sweetheart. Lillian telling Sophie she loved her, that Sophie was special, that their bond was unique and meant to be. Lillian saying that I didn't understand Sophie the way she did, that Sophie should spend less time at home where she wasn't appreciated. Messages about how, when Sophie turned 18, they could be together openly without anyone questioning their relationship. Photos Lillian had sent of herself in casual clothes, workout clothes, even one in a bathing suit. Sophie's responses were equally intimate, calling Lillian her soulmate, saying she counted the days until their sessions, that she wished she could live at Lillian's house permanently. Messages about physical affection, hugs that lasted long, Lillian stroking Sophie's hair and face. Messages about lying on Lillian's couch together watching movies. Nothing explicitly sexual, but deeply inappropriate for a therapist-patient relationship. I took screenshots of everything and called the police immediately. The officer who answered said I should contact the state licensing board for therapists, that this sounded like an ethical violation rather than a crime unless there was evidence of sexual abuse. I called the licensing board and filed an emergency complaint, describing the text messages and inappropriate boundaries. They said they'd investigate, but it could take months, that they needed to follow proper procedures. I called a lawyer who specialized in professional misconduct. She reviewed the screenshots and said this was textbook grooming behavior, that Dr. Foster was creating emotional dependency and inappropriate intimacy to prepare Sophie for a sexual relationship once she was legally an adult. The lawyer said proving harm would be difficult because the messages didn't contain explicit sexual content and Sophie was a willing participant in the relationship. She recommended documenting everything, recording any future interactions, and immediately terminating therapy. When I told Sophie we were done with Dr. Foster, she screamed at me for 2 hours, saying I was destroying the one good thing in her life, that I was jealous of her having someone who actually understood her. Dr. Foster called the next day, calm and professional. She said Sophie had reached out in crisis and that she was concerned about my sudden interference with treatment. She suggested I was experiencing a psychological break related to grief and control issues, that my accusations were delusional and potentially dangerous to Sophie's mental health. She said she'd be filing her own report with Child Protective Services about my erratic behavior and concerning restriction of Sophie's access to necessary medical care. Within 24 hours, I received a call from CPS saying they'd received a report that I was preventing my daughter from receiving mental health treatment and showing signs of paranoid delusions. The caseworker, a woman named Angela Frost, came to our house to investigate. I showed her the text messages between Sophie and Dr. Foster. Angela looked through them carefully and said while the messages were concerning, they didn't show clear evidence of abuse and that terminating therapy, because I didn't like my daughter's relationship with her therapist, could be seen as medical neglect. She said she'd keep the case open and monitor the situation. Sophie became increasingly hostile toward me. She refused to eat meals with me, locked herself in her room constantly, and threatened to run away if I didn't let her continue therapy with Dr. Foster. She said she'd tell CPS I was abusive, that I hit her and screamed at her, that she didn't feel safe in our home. Dr. Foster had clearly coached her on what to say to authorities. Angela Frost came back for a second visit and interviewed Sophie privately. Afterwards, she told me Sophie had made concerning allegations about my behavior, that she seemed genuinely afraid of me. I asked what specific allegations, and Angela said she couldn't share details of a minor's confidential interview. She said she was recommending supervised visitation, and that Sophie might be placed in temporary foster care while the investigation continued. I felt my world collapsing, watching my daughter being weaponized against me by a predator who'd convinced everyone I was the threat. I contacted every parent whose child saw Dr. Foster, finding their names through insurance billing records my lawyer subpoenaed. Out of 12 families, 3 were willing to meet with me. 2 of them had daughters around Sophie's age who'd been in intensive therapy with Dr. Foster for years. Both families described similar patterns: the texting relationship, the home sessions, the sleepovers, their daughters becoming emotionally dependent on the therapist and distant from their families. One mother said she'd tried to end therapy, and her daughter had attempted suicide, after which Dr. Foster convinced her the suicide attempt was caused by the mother's interference with treatment. That daughter was now 18 and had moved in with Dr. Foster, calling the therapist her chosen family. The other family had quietly stopped therapy after finding inappropriate messages, but their daughter had run away twice trying to get back to Dr. Foster's house. They'd never reported it because Dr. Foster threatened to testify in custody proceedings that they were neglectful parents who denied their child necessary medical care. The third family's story was even more disturbing. Their daughter had been in therapy with Dr. Foster from age 12 to 17. The girl had become so dependent on the therapist that she'd legally changed her last name to Foster when she turned 18. She'd cut off all contact with her biological family and now worked as Dr. Foster's assistant, living in the therapist's home and helping recruit new patients. The parents had tried everything to maintain a relationship with their daughter, but Dr. Foster had successfully alienated her completely. They'd consulted lawyers, therapists, and even cult deprogramming specialists, but were told that once their daughter turned 18, there was nothing they could do. Their daughter believed Dr. Foster was her real family, and her biological parents were toxic people who'd tried to prevent her healing. The mother cried as she told me this, saying she'd lost her daughter to a predator disguised as a healer, and that nobody had believed her concerns until it was too late. Armed with testimony from other families, my lawyer filed for an emergency restraining order against Dr. Foster, prohibiting contact with Sophie. The judge reviewed the evidence and granted a temporary order, saying the messages showed concerning boundary violations that warranted investigation. Dr. Foster's lawyer immediately filed a countermotion claiming I was harassing his client and interfering with her licensed practice. The hearing was contentious, with Dr. Foster testifying that her therapeutic methods were unconventional but effective, that she specialized in attachment-based therapy for traumatized adolescents, and that close therapeutic relationships were necessary for healing. She had expert witnesses, other therapists who testified that modern trauma therapy required breaking down traditional boundaries. She had research papers about alternative therapeutic relationships. She painted me as an overprotective father who couldn't handle his daughter bonding with another woman. Sophie testified on Dr. Foster's behalf, saying I was controlling and paranoid, that Dr. Foster had saved her life, that ending therapy would destroy her. The judge ruled that while Dr. Foster's methods were unusual, there was insufficient evidence of harm to maintain the restraining order. He ordered that therapy could continue, but must be conducted only in Dr. Foster's licensed office, not at her home, and that text messages should be limited to scheduling appointments. Dr. Foster claimed victory, telling Sophie that we'd won and could continue their special relationship. But the investigation by the licensing board was ongoing, and my lawyer convinced them to expedite it given the multiple complaints from families. The board assigned an investigator named Marcus Levin who took the case seriously. He interviewed Sophie, interviewed me, interviewed Dr. Foster, and reviewed all the text messages and documentation. He also tracked down former patients, including the young woman who now lived with Dr. Foster. His report was damning. He found that Dr. Foster had a pattern spanning 15 years of targeting vulnerable adolescent girls who'd experienced maternal loss or trauma. She'd create intense emotional bonds, position herself as the replacement mother figure, isolate the girls from their families, and transition the relationships into romantic partnerships once the girls turned 18. 3 former patients testified that their relationships with Dr. Foster had become sexual after they reached adulthood, and that Dr. Foster had systematically alienated them from their families during their teen years. The investigator discovered that Dr. Foster had been disciplined twice before in other states for boundary violations, but had successfully sealed those records through legal settlements. She'd moved to our state and started fresh, using glowing references from colleagues who either didn't know about her past or had been convinced her previous accusers were vindictive parents. The licensing board in our state had never checked with other state boards because it wasn't required at the time. Dr. Foster had exploited this gap to continue her predatory pattern. Marcus Levin's report recommended immediate license suspension and criminal investigation. 3 months after filing the complaint, the board issued preliminary findings that Dr. Foster had violated multiple ethical boundaries, engaging in dual relationships with patients, creating inappropriate emotional dependency, conducting therapy in non-professional settings without proper documentation, failing to maintain appropriate professional distance, and using her position of trust to groom minors for adult relationships. They suspended her license, pending a full hearing. Dr. Foster hired expensive lawyers and the case dragged through administrative proceedings for 8 months. During that time, Sophie spiraled. Without access to Dr. Foster, she became depressed and angry. She refused to see other therapists, saying no one could replace Lillian. She ran away twice, trying to get to Dr. Foster's house. The police brought her back both times, and the incidents were documented in the CPS file. Angela Frost's investigation eventually cleared me of Sophie's allegations after she interviewed Sophie's teachers, friends, and family members, who confirmed Sophie had been happy and healthy before starting therapy with Dr. Foster. Angela apologized for initially doubting my concerns and wrote a report supporting my decision to terminate Sophie's treatment. She said the case had opened her eyes to how sophisticated predators could manipulate systems designed to protect children. Dr. Foster filed for legal guardianship of Sophie, claiming I was an unfit parent who was preventing necessary medical treatment. The court denied it after reviewing the licensing board's findings, but the attempt showed how far she was willing to go. I found a therapist who specialized in cultic abuse and coercive control to work with Sophie. Dr. Raymond Park had experience helping people exit high-control relationships and understood the dynamics of therapeutic abuse. Sophie initially refused to see him, but after her second runaway attempt landed her in a psychiatric hospital for evaluation, she agreed to try. Dr. Park didn't push Sophie to admit she'd been groomed or manipulated. Instead, he helped her explore her own feelings and experiences, asking questions that let her draw her own conclusions. Slowly, Sophie began to see inconsistencies in Dr. Foster's behavior. She remembered times when Dr. Foster had said things that now seemed manipulative. Times when Dr. Foster had encouraged her to lie to me about their activities. Times when Dr. Foster had criticized my parenting in ways that now felt like attempts to create distance between us. The healing was agonizingly slow, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but Sophie was gradually emerging from Dr. Foster's influence. The final licensing board hearing took place in a large conference room with a panel of 5 board members presiding. It included testimony from 5 families whose daughters had been in therapy with Dr. Foster. Each family described similar patterns, targeting girls who'd lost their mothers, creating intense emotional bonds, blurring professional boundaries, isolating the girls from their families, and positioning herself as the true source of love and understanding. The mother whose daughter now lived with Dr. Foster testified about losing her child to someone who'd exploited her grief and vulnerability. Another father described how Dr. Foster had convinced his daughter that he was emotionally abusive and that only the therapist truly cared about her well-being. A third family testified about their daughter's suicide attempt after they tried to end therapy and how Dr. Foster had used that attempt to regain control and deepen the dependency. 3 former patients testified about their experiences. The young woman who lived with Dr. Foster initially defended her, saying their relationship was consensual and loving, that her biological parents had been toxic, and Dr. Foster had saved her. But under questioning from the board's attorney, she admitted the romantic relationship had started with emotional intimacy during therapy sessions when she was 15, that Dr. Foster had told her they were soulmates who had to wait until she was 18 to be together openly, that Dr. Foster had systematically destroyed her relationship with her parents by convincing her they were abusive and unloving. She broke down crying as she realized she was describing grooming, not rescue. Another former patient, now 23, testified that her relationship with Dr. Foster had become sexual shortly after her 18th birthday, that Dr. Foster had prepared her for this transition through years of boundary violations disguised as therapy. She said she'd spent 5 years in a relationship with Dr. Foster before realizing she'd been exploited, and that she was still working through the trauma of having her adolescent grief weaponized against her. The board's expert witness, a psychologist who specialized in professional ethics, explained how Dr. Foster's behavior fit classic patterns of predatory professionals who use their positions of trust to groom victims. She testified that the extended therapy sessions, the home visits, the constant texting, the creation of dependency, and the isolation from family were all recognized grooming tactics. She said Dr. Foster had essentially created a stable of emotionally dependent young women who she could transition into romantic relationships once they reached legal adulthood, all while maintaining the facade of therapeutic care. The expert noted that Dr. Foster's targeting of girls who'd lost their mothers was particularly calculated, as these victims were desperately seeking maternal connection and were more vulnerable to someone offering to fill that role. The testimony was devastating and irrefutable. Dr. Foster's defense focused on attacking the credibility of the families and former patients. Her lawyers suggested the parents were overprotective and couldn't accept their daughters bonding with a maternal figure. They claimed the former patients were lying because their own romantic relationships had ended and they were bitter. They presented Dr. Foster as an innovative therapist whose unconventional methods threatened the conservative psychology establishment. They had their own expert witnesses who testified about the evolution of therapeutic boundaries and the need for flexibility in treating trauma. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. The board found Dr. Foster guilty of gross professional misconduct on 17 separate counts and revoked her license permanently. She was banned from practicing psychology in our state and reported to national licensing databases to prevent her from obtaining licenses elsewhere. The board also referred her case to law enforcement for criminal investigation. The district attorney's office assigned a prosecutor named Jennifer Kwan, who specialized in cases involving exploitation of vulnerable individuals. She reviewed all the evidence from the licensing board hearing and determined there was sufficient evidence to file criminal charges. Dr. Foster was charged with contributing to the delinquency of minors, unlawful imprisonment regarding 2 patients she'd prevented from leaving her home during supposed therapeutic retreats, and sexual exploitation of patients. The charges related to former patients whose relationships with Dr. Foster had become sexual after they turned 18, with prosecutors arguing that the grooming during their minor years made them unable to consent even as adults because the power dynamic and dependency had been created through professional exploitation. The legal theory was novel, but the evidence was strong. Dr. Foster's criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented a meticulous case showing the pattern of behavior across multiple victims over 15 years. They showed how Dr. Foster had created a system of grooming that started with professional therapy and evolved into romantic relationships she'd orchestrated from the beginning. They demonstrated that she'd targeted the most vulnerable patients, exploited their grief and trauma, isolated them from their families, and prepared them for adult relationships while they were still minors under her care. The defense argued that the adult relationships were consensual and that Dr. Foster's therapeutic methods, while unconventional, were not criminal. They tried to portray the former patients as vindictive women who'd turned on someone who'd helped them because their relationships hadn't worked out. Sophie attended the trial, sitting in the gallery with me every day. Watching the testimony from other families, hearing the expert witnesses explain grooming tactics, seeing Dr. Foster's carefully constructed facade crack under cross-examination, it all helped Sophie understand what had happened to her. She realized she wasn't the special chosen one that Dr. Foster had made her feel she was. She was one of many victims in a systematic pattern of exploitation. Dr. Park said this realization was crucial for her healing, understanding that the manipulation wasn't about her being uniquely valuable to Dr. Foster, but about her being uniquely vulnerable to Dr. Foster's tactics. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts. Dr. Foster was sentenced to 8 years in prison, which felt inadequate given the scope of harm, but was significant for charges involving psychological rather than physical abuse. Sophie's recovery continued slowly over the following years. She finished high school with the help of Dr. Park's therapy and intensive support from family and friends who'd stood by us. She wrote a detailed account of her experience with Dr. Foster that she shared with the licensing board and law enforcement, helping them understand the patient's perspective and the sophisticated nature of the manipulation. Her testimony contributed to policy changes requiring stricter oversight of therapist-patient communications and prohibiting home-based therapy sessions without third-party supervision. She attended support groups for survivors of professional abuse and found community with others who'd been exploited by therapists, doctors, teachers, and coaches who'd used their positions of trust to groom victims. The civil lawsuit against Dr. Foster's practice and the insurance company that covered her resulted in a significant settlement that helped pay for Sophie's ongoing therapy and future education. More importantly, it established legal precedent that insurance companies could be held liable for professionals they insured who engaged in systematic grooming of patients, creating incentive for insurers to monitor therapists more carefully. Other families whose children had been victimized by Dr. Foster filed their own lawsuits, and the resulting judgments bankrupted Dr. Foster financially and destroyed any remaining professional reputation she might have salvaged. Years later, Sophie works as an advocate for therapy abuse survivors, helping others recognize manipulation and exploitation disguised as professional care. She speaks at conferences about grooming tactics in therapeutic relationships and trains licensing boards on red flags they should investigate. She says the hardest part was that everyone had told me I was paranoid, that my concerns were dismissed until undeniable evidence forced people to see the truth. She knows now that my instinct had been right from the first session, that the wrongness I felt was real, and that trusting that instinct despite everyone saying I was crazy had saved her from something worse. She also knows that many children aren't as lucky, that they have parents who either don't notice the warning signs or who are successfully convinced by predatory professionals that their concerns are baseless. Her advocacy work focuses on empowering parents to trust their instincts and creating systems that take parental concerns seriously, rather than dismissing them as overprotection or paranoia. She tells audiences that predators count on being more believable than their victims' advocates, and that breaking through that credibility gap requires persistence, documentation, and refusing to be silenced by professional authority. Today, she's helping others fight battles similar to the one we fought, and every family she helps represents a victory over the kind of abuse that nearly destroyed our family. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.